Fans of A Song of Ice and Fire have been enamored with King Euron Greyjoy ever since he won the King's Moot and assumed the Sea-Sown chair. He's promised to drastically shift the status quo in Westeros and aims to attain the Iron Throne itself. Many have speculated on his plans, specifically referencing numerous magical elements which he's connected to. Specifically, he claims to have sailed to Asshai into Valyria and has many magical artifacts, including Valyrian steel armor, which is incredibly cool, and a dragon horn that is supposed to bind Daenerys' dragons to him. He seems to be in the process of raising krakens from the deep early on in the Winds of Winter via preview chapters, and this apocalyptic event seems to be merely the tip of the Euron iceberg. However, today we are going to be examining the Crow's Eye in a way that's not often discussed, as Westeros' most eligible bachelor. Ever since his introduction in A Feast for Crows, one of the Crow's Eye's most prominent objectives has been securing a marriage alliance. His singular gaze has been fixated entirely on Daenerys thus far in the story, though it seems as though that may change as time goes on. It's good to note that Dany is not only already married, but also half a world away. Euron isn't headed back to Essos anytime soon, as he just got back from being exiled, so it's a good idea to examine any possible option for Euron Greyjoy's potential bride, as he's a very important character in the Winds of Winter, it seems, if the preview chapters and what happened in Dance with Dragons is to be believed. Before hopping into candidates for marriage, it's important to consider what values Euron looks for in a partner, as all matchmakers such as myself have to do. As far as we've seen in the story, Euron has been romantically interested in three individuals so far. First and foremost, Daenerys Targaryen. Euron specifically thinks she'd be a great match for a king of the Iron Islands and for an eventual king of Westeros. Though thus far his main interest seems to be primarily her dragons, not in her as a person, which is unfortunate but makes sense given his focus on magical power. This interest in magic seems to be shared in his other romantic interests in the series, and I'm using very heavy air quotes, though you can't see my hands. Thalia Flowers. Despite being warned against the Crow's Eye, Thalia finds herself carrying his child during the Forsaken chapter of The Winds of Winter. The relationship seems to be just peachy until the end of the chapter, where Aeron finds her rendered mute and about to be used as a part of a mass ritualistic blood sacrifice in the hopes of unleashing krakens from the deep. The other relationship we hear about is Euron's seduction of Victarion's wife, though that seems to be more for the sake of messing with his brother's head and gaining power over Victarion than any romantic interest, so to speak. So, what can we take from these romantic ideals from the first storm and the last? He's quite interested in two things. Firstly, magic, as demonstrated by his relationships with Dany and her dragons, and Thalia as a potential blood sacrifice engine. Additionally, he's quite interested in power, as demonstrated by his attractions to Dany and to Victarion's unnamed wife. Both of these values will be crucial to bear in mind as we discuss who might bind themselves to Euron Greyjoy in matrimony. We've also got one final clue coming from the Forsaken chapter. As Aeron is captive on Euron's ship, the king forces his brother to imbibe a drug known as Shade of the Evening, which causes psychedelic visions in those who consume it. Aeron is forced to endure a number of haunting visions, and yet one of them stands apart as particularly indicative of Euron's fate and his goal of the throne. To quote from the Forsaken chapter, which is one of my favorite chapters in the series, the dreams were even worse the second time. He saw the long ships of the Ironborn adrift and burning on a boiling, blood-red sea. He saw his brother on the Iron Throne again, but Euron was no longer human. He seemed more squid than man, a monster fathered by a kraken of the deep, his face a mass of writhing tentacles. Beside him stood a shadow in woman's form, long and tall and terrible, her hands alive with the pale white fire. Dwarves capered for their amusement, male and female, naked and misshapen, locked in carnal embrace, biting and tearing each other as Euron and his mate laughed and laughed and laughed. Also, just wanted to throw this in quickly before we get into candidates. I'd really appreciate it if you left a like and subscribed. That really helps me grow the channel, and I'd love to make more content on A Song of Ice and Fire in the future. So, yeah, please do those things. Let's get into the three people that Euron might marry. All of these previous hints and prophecies create an interesting framework for any potential bride, and there are three specific candidates who I'm going to examine in today's video. The first of these, and perhaps the most obvious choice, is Daenerys Targaryen. As discussed previously, Dany is the individual who Euron is currently attempting to marry, and she's very heavily associated with fire, just like the woman in Aeron's vision. What's more, we know that she has a certain preference for men who could be viewed as evil or as dark influences on her and her rulership. She remarks several times that people such as her consort Daario Naharis are negative influences on her, and Daenerys pursues him nevertheless. Some even think that Dario and Euron are one and the same, but I'm far too sober to get into that particular can of Krakens today. All of that said, Dany marrying Euron seems quite unlikely. She's already married to Hisdar Zalorak, and it seems as though there could be a number of better candidates for her hand in marriage in the near future, most likely Aegon Targaryen or Jon Snow. Those two are different people in the books. I don't want to get into the show or show Euron at all. Even just thinking about it is upsetting my stomach. What's more, Victarion is currently traveling to Dany, and he'll likely poison the well regarding Euron and his evil ways. Victarion's intention is to marry Dany himself, so it seems quite likely that Dany won't even hear Euron's proposal anytime in the near future. Though it also doesn't seem likely that she'll marry Victarion, as Victarion is pretty dumb and pretty evil, and I don't think those are a great combination in terms of people that Daenerys would be interested in. Cersei Lannister is another character who could fit the bill as a potential bride for Euron Greyjoy. She's another powerful bachelorette, and she's been single since the tragic and completely accidental death of her previous husband. It's also good to note that Cersei is rapidly running out of allies in King's Landing, as she's alienated a massive number of people through her expert politicking throughout A Feast for Crows. Furthermore, as stated in my previous video on Euron's plans, he seems to be heading directly to King's Landing itself, as that is the path that he's followed so far in his journeys since the Iron Island. The Iron Throne is indicated to be his goal during the aforementioned vision in the Forsaken chapter, and it makes sense that he would be making a beeline directly to the throne and then to Cersei. What's more, fire might not seem to be the most intuitive connection with Cersei Lannister, but it does seem as though she certainly enjoys fire or pyromania to some degree. In Book 4, she burns the Tower of the Hand, which could be an indication that she plans on dealing with the Faith Militant in much the same way she does in the show. If that were to be the case, she would certainly alienate all possible allies that aren't cartoonishly evil. Unfortunately, Euron seems as though he'd love something that's that evil and that horrible. What's more, if we're talking about the show, they do end up getting married there, which I don't like using as an indication, but it could mean something, as it could have been a note from Martin himself that these two might be kindred spirits in some form or another. However, there are still issues with Cersei being the one to get married to Euron. Most of the evidence I've presented is pretty speculatory, and not much of it is based on the text itself. What's more, if Cersei's connection to fire is a point in her favor, it's a connection to wildfire specifically. If that's what Aeron saw in his vision, I'd imagine the flames would be described as green before they're described as pale. Additionally, Cersei's plot seems to be quite tied to Jaime, and that isn't really involved in the Ironborn whatsoever, so it could be kind of messy to involve her in that as well. The final candidate to be discussed today, and the one that I personally believe to be the most likely to marry Euron Greyjoy, is the Red Priestess Melisandre of Ashai. She ticks all three boxes that we've discussed perfectly, in that she is powerful, she's connected to magic, and she matches Aeron's vision to a T. Going through all of that step by step, she is quite magical in a way that we don't see many other characters being in our story. We're also in her head as a point of view character, and she could serve as a new viewpoint with which to interact with Euron rather than Aeron, as Aeron does seem to be on his way out as a part of a blood sacrifice ritual. People have speculated that Melisandre will do something to bring Jon back from the dead, potentially sacrificing Shireen or others to do it. And Jon, unless death changes his status on child murder, will likely not like that Melisandre did this and probably send her away. She might have to go somewhere else, and that could result in her ending up with Euron. This would very much parallel the connection between Victarion and the Red Priest Makoro, as we see in A Dance with Dragons. In order to more concretely prove this, we need to look specifically at Aeron's vision and look at the details presented therein. Specifically, the words pale fire come up some in our story, but not a lot. One of the first uses of that term is in Davos's first chapter in A Clash of Kings, where we're getting reintroduced to Melisandre from a point of view that isn't Cressen's. We see that the ritual that she is currently doing has these pale flames going on, and she's kind of in the center of them, weaving them, working them. She is alight with this pale fire. What's more, the vision is described to have a tall woman in it, and she is the only candidate of our three candidates who could really be described as tall. Cersei and Daenerys are both remarked to be fairly short or average height for women, whereas Melisandre is remarked to be taller than most knights, which is pretty strange for most women in the story who aren't Brienne. And I don't think Brienne is particularly likely to marry Euron, but you never know. Speaking of visions, we know that Melisandre is, at least to some peripheral, almost even subconscious degree, aware of Euron. As we know that within A Dance with Dragons, she has a vision that very much represents Euron and his current goings on in the Winds of Winter. To quote from her chapter in The Dance with Dragons, "Some may. Could the skulls in her vision have signified this bridge? Somehow Melisandre did not think so. If it comes, that attack will be no more than a diversion. I saw towers by the sea, submerged beneath a black and bloody tide. That is where the heaviest blow will fall." As stated in my previous Euron video, the Towers by the Sea with the black and bloody tide is very likely a vision of the Battle of Blood. Melisandre is either foreseeing this or seeing this as it happens. And that means that she has, to some degree, seen Euron, or at least his most significant magical achievement so far, in some degree or another, on a subconscious level or something similar. And that seems as though it'll be somewhat of a basis for at least mutual respect, if not some form of connection. Euron, as we've seen, is very tied to magic and very interested in magic. And given the fact that Melisandre's MO in the past has been kind of being a seductress and trying to get in with people that way, it could very much be this kind of alliance of darkness between Euron and Melisandre, as their two deities do seem to be forces of maybe neutrality, if not outright evil. This connection is also solidified, as I said earlier, as the connection between Victarion and Makoro, as it's both a priest of the drowned god and of the god of fire, as both of these two opposite forces do seem to be working in harmony in certain parts of our story, which is kind of an interesting connection that I might delve into in another video in the future. I'm throwing this in pretty late in the editing process, but I came across another piece of evidence that I really like for this theory. Aaron describes Euron's bride as a shadow in woman's form, and we've heard at least one other woman described as a shadow, that being Melisandre. The first time we're introduced to her in the Crescent prologue chapter of A Clash of Kings, we hear Patchface describe her as the shadows. The shadows come to dance, my lord, and to stay, my lord. This kind of haunting imagery ties her both into prophecy as a shadow and seemingly into this same vision that Aaron has seen, that perhaps is also connected to Pat's face through the drowned god, sharing this imagery. It's another small connection that I wanted to throw in before the end of the video. It's also good to note that these are two of the only characters in our story who claim to have been to Ashai by the Shadow, which is one of the most mysterious and magical cities in the world. It's a really interesting little connection between the two of them, and could be a good kind of conversation starter if they were to ever meet. So, this has been the video on Euron Greyjoy and who he might marry. Who do you think it'll be? Personally, as I said, I do think it'll be Melisandre, but I could see it being either Cersei or Daenerys or another candidate that I haven't even touched on. Be sure to like this video and subscribe, it really helps me grow the channel, I really appreciate it. And let me know in the comments down below who exactly you think is the person that Euron is going to marry in the future. I've been Quinn the GM, thank you all so much for watching, and I hope you all have a great day.